the great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from.
There were some backroom meetings.
There was.
And a lot of beer drunk in San Francisco.
If one of the big tech players wants to, they can ignore the entire world of SMPTE standards.
There are no standards police.
It's actually quite inconvenient for everybody if there's one kind of body.
But it does open up an interesting question around how you've got individual vendors where they will put out and essentially become a standard.
The hard bit is getting smart people, particularly engineers, with vested interests to agree on a compromise.
Actually, what we need to do is use the right tool for the job, and maybe AI can help. We're not necessarily sure yet.
We're talking about new technologies, fundamentally.
I am absolutely ready to go.
Excellent.
I've been spending all of this morning writing some open source, wishing that somebody else would do it for me, so maybe standards might help.
It's a great pleasure for us to have some esteemed guests here tonight to have a little discussion about open standards and open source in media. We've had the preamble, we had the warm up, we learned about TAMS, we learned about DMF. That was fantastic. Thank you very much, guys. And so we're going to launch the panel. I would like, maybe we'll go round and just do a brief introduction. I think most people know who we are, but let's do a really short introduction starting from left to right. So starting with David.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yeah, I obviously introduced myself earlier, but yeah, I'm David LiveWyer. I'm the founder of LiveWyer. We are a cloud infrastructure modernization company.
I am Bruce Devlin. It's my fault. Let's get that out of the way straight off the bat. I ran standards at SMPTE for somewhere between 5 and 8 years, depending on how you count. I know a lot about standards. I'm responsible for many of them, and I'm sorry.
I'm Sam Messerton-Gibbons. I'm a senior R&D engineer with BBC Research and Development, one of the creators of the TAMS API.
And I'm Russell. I've been an engineer for a lot of my time, and right now I'm really interested in open standards.
What do people want from open standards? So everybody says they want open standards. They want interoperability in media. They want open standards. They want everything to plug together in this sort of magical way. So why is it so hard? And I think this is a question to really start with Bruce, because I think Bruce has been through it. Why is it so hard to get an open standard together?
So let's figure out what open means. Legally, an open standard is one for which there is no subjective barrier to helping make the standard. So, for example, ISO, like the top of the standards tree, the International Standards Organization, there's a clue in the name, there is no barrier to joining ISO as long as you're a country. So if you're a country, you can join ISO. It's as simple as that. There are some debates around the world about what a country is, and not everyone agrees on what is a country and what isn't a country, but that's subject to wars and other stuff. The other thing I just want to say about standards is there are no standards police. So whether it's ISO or whether it's SMPTE or whether it's DPP or whether you're making your own standards, there is no armed police force that will come around and shoot you if you don't follow those standards. However, if you're trying to get a lot of people to agree on something that you want to be stable, typically you go to a standards organization to write it down, and then countries might pass laws. For example, it would be really inconvenient if, for example, the British decided on one unit of measurements and the French decided on a different, yes, I'm talking about you, and the French came along and decided on a completely different unit of measurements. Particularly it would be nasty if the French system was the one that won and the British system got pushed aside. That would be terrible. But we live with that. And then people make laws that then refer to the standards. The standards are really useful if you don't want things to ever change. And an open standard just means if you pay your money to show up at the meetings, you're good. I'm going to stop there and see if that's controversial.
I guess just to sort of dig into this idea of interoperability.
Mm-hmm.
What makes an open standard somehow interoperable? What's the gap there, as it were?
Typically, an interoperable open standard has people who have a common problem. They rock up into a room for anything between 1 and 17 years, and eventually they agree. Now, when I was running SMPTE standards, everyone used to complain about how long it took to create a standard. And we proved, because we did a few of them, that you can go from start to finish in 6 weeks. The hard bit is getting smart people, particularly engineers, with vested interests to agree on a compromise. That can take forever. And sometimes you can't agree. So for example, everybody understand what HDR is? Put your hand up. Keep your hand up if you think there are 4 HDR standards. Keep your hand up if you think there are 3. Keep your hand up if you think there are 2. Okay, so 3 is about the right number. So you can't force people to agree on stuff. You can only get them to agree on one solution if either it's the right solution or you have to do it so fast that everybody is willing to compromise.
Okay. So what's let's go into what's an example of a good standard that we like that's interoperable. I mean, think about USB, for example, maybe. It works. There we go. Or I mean, Bluetooth. That was a bit of a bun fight, wasn't it? I mean,
Yep.
I remember early Bluetooth was not interoperable at all between different vendors. And I don't know if this isn't really our area of expertise as media people, but I guess that the Bluetooth story kind of highlights the challenges in some ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it always comes down to people. And people tend not to be malleable. They tend to have very strong opinions, particularly if their legal team is standing behind them during the discussions. So let's take, everybody heard of timecode? I know it's a bit old-fashioned and we don't use it so much now, other than the fact that all of America runs on it. But timecode was SMPTE's most successful standard, went around the world. Spookily, financially, it didn't make much difference to the companies using it or the companies that made it, but there is a lot of money depending on timecode being interoperable and working. However, it failed under a great many circumstances, so over the years it was patched. But over the years, people had these needs that were really important and they were willing to compromise to stop themselves hemorrhaging money, like crash locking your clocks in your TV studios at 2 o'clock in the morning. That seemed like a perfectly reasonable compromise. Now, go on. So TAMS, for example, as an API might never be standardized, but some of the concepts within the API might well be, so that future APIs build on things that are absolutely rock solid. Like, what do you mean by time? What does the relationship between time and the media mean? Those things, those are really ripe for real solid standardization, and then you can guarantee the API would work, in my opinion.
I think there's an interesting question there, though, because the internet works on request for comment. It doesn't. It never graduates beyond being a request for comment. That's what RFC stands for, and it's built on rough consensus and running code, and that kind of works.
Yep.
And there's been this long question in the back of my mind of, like, how much of that can we just use? Where does the line stop where you can't get by with a rough consensus and running code, and you need to reach for something like SMPTE? And I think you're right about the laws thing. That's absolutely a good way to look at it. And pulling bits out that are so important, we have to formally govern it.
Yep.
But also there's this question of, okay, who controls this? Like, we have this kind of question we're starting to think about with the TAMS work. The BBC cannot be the benevolent dictator of that repository forever.
Indeed.
There has to be a sustainable solution. We just haven't figured out what it is yet. It's still, there are lots of discussions about that.
I mean, I guess in the internet world, standards like Quick, for example, are single vendor originated, but then they're an RFC. They haven't been through some lengthy negotiation and approval process. Is that the way forward, or what are the downsides of doing it that way?
But an RFC is not necessarily... Not all RFCs are made equal. There are 3 different tiers of RFC, and the top level of an RFC is actually very, very stable and is never changed, but can be superseded by a future RFC. So they are standards, but they're just defined slightly differently to the way other people define standards. So ISO has a number. I've got this document, and it's got a date reference. But RFCs are more like a GitHub repo, where everything's got a tag, and you just have to know which tag you're working to. But the names are different, but the process is still the same. To get your RFC to that top tier absolutely stable, there are some heated discussions behind the scenes. Not everyone agrees.
But it does open up an interesting question around how you've got individual vendors where they will put out and essentially become a standard, but then the industry goes, we need this, but we don't want it to be owned by the vendor.
Yes.
And so now that does become the template to become the open standard. So like the equivalent in in more the cloud space would be like Docker being a standard for how we ran containers, but then the industry went, right, we need to open this up, and then that's where the OCI came around and allowed a more open interface for running containers, but it was all backwards compatible with how Docker ran.
And a lot of the IPR in the Docker story got fought over immensely.
Yep.
Not quite sure how it all got smoothed out, but I think there were some backroom meetings.
There was.
And a lot of beer drunk in San Francisco. But eventually there was no IPR associated with that, and we didn't have the mess of something like the MPEG standard, where these licensing teams tried to basically screw all the money out of the media industries and put them into the pockets of people chasing patents. And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to that. If you can get the agreement to publish enough of it, and for the IPR to be, effectively given to the organizations, because the volume of money you'll make through operations is so much greater than the licensing fees. I think that's what's really changed now. I think
I agree.
That's massive.
And especially in that model where there was, I think in many ways it was their it was their footholds to get into the industry, but then they recognized, like you said, that for them the money came from the operating. It wasn't from owning the sort of developer space or the runtime space. It was trying to make more inroads into the operational and the services space around.
Interesting question. How do you think that applies to something like AWS S3? So that is a single vendor thing. Amazon control the S3 API, but every cloud object store, it's table stakes to have an S3 interface.
That's true.
But there's not a standard, or it's Amazon's thing.
It is Amazon's thing, and what you'll see is that when the cloud operators talk about their S3 endpoint, it's not an S3, it's a star.
Yeah.
It's S3 endpoint, and these are the limitations. It's not like it's never been put together as, we have an absolute like-for-like compatibility. It's more like we can do the basic stuff to allow certain basic operations. So if you've got software that's coded to the S3 API, you're going to be able to do your puts, you're going to be able to do your gets. But beyond that, in terms of size and etc., people aren't necessarily expecting a like-for-like.
So, David, we've talked about TAMS being an open source standard. I guess what does that really mean from your perspective in the cloud native world? What do we mean by open source, and what are the different types of open source that we could be considering?
Oh God! So just a narrow question. I suppose you're talking about standards, and then you're also then talking about the sort of licenses, sort of the two sides of it. So when you're talking about the standards, then we're talking about W3C and things like this, HTTP. Yeah. But then if we're talking more about licensing, that's probably where this gets kind of interesting. So the question I have to you just about is TAMS, what license is it under?
Apache 2, I hope.
Okay, good. And because in that space you've got licenses which are what they call permissive, which are ones which are more permissive to the end user to do more with. So you can take the software and you can use the software and it's a permissive model for the end user to do what they want with it. And then there's the copyleft sort of models, which are more, it's more about the freedoms around the software itself. So yes, you can do this, but you've got certain liabilities when it comes to how you then distribute the software, maintain the openness of the software. So it's more focused on maintaining the openness of the freedom of the software. It's good to hear that that's under Apache 2.
And what constitutes software in the terms of a standard? Are we saying that a JSON format, for example, we including that in the definition of software?
Interesting. Usually we're talking about the software of the service itself. Oh, the spec. But yeah, that's an interesting situation. Like, how do you judge it when it comes to TAMS? It's like you've got your repo, and within that you're setting standards. So by that, are the standards then inherited?
In the sense of the license to the software that you build.
Yeah.
I think it's separable, and it has to be separable, and partly that is, again, due to the unique way the BBC is funded, which is why the TAMS API is an API specification with not really any code, because the rules say we couldn't give that away. So we then see implementations, like obviously AWS of open source, their implementation, and that's great. I know of at least 3 other implementations on GitHub, and I'm sure there are others that obviously we can't see because they're private. I think for the sort of practical goals of a piece of work like TAMS, as long as you speak the same interface, that's enough. And I think that's kind of the important thing to be open, particularly given the shape of the media industry. It would be nice if there's more open source implementations of the software. I'd love to see that, but I say this while knowing full well that I can't produce any because fair trading.
So Russell, you talked earlier about the DMF project, and I understand, and I don't know how much you know about this, but I understand the DMF project is going through the Linux Foundation as a standards body, as a hub to hold the material. Tell me more about how that works.
I'm definitely not the person to tell you the answer to that. I think this is working. No, but the point is that of bringing the Linux Foundation in, and people can correct me in the Q&A if necessary, is to have that standards bearer make sure that it's a little bit like your view on the BBC can't be doing it forever. It's actually quite inconvenient for everybody if there's one kind of body which is holding the keys. So this is a great way, from my point of view, as a vendor who'd like to be involved. For me, it shows that there is a dedication to the open source methods, being open, making sure that there's not too much of interference from any one side, as best as open source can do. That's it's always the issue, isn't it? It's a bit of a bum fight sometimes. You get not enough people, you get too many people. But that's part of the beast, and it works, and it's great. But you've got to do something to put a little bit of structure around it.
Exactly, and it's the structure that it provides. So the Linux Foundation provides that sort of level of governance and stewardship, and it provides a framework for organizations to contribute code, and then there's people have a level of confidence, or then they understand what it gives, a common language around what's going to happen to that code going into the future. So for companies who are now building products around it, interfacing with it, there's it increases the level of confidence. It gives a sort of contract of, okay, at this stage in a graduation process, this is what I should expect from this project at this time.
The alternative is that if you think about competitors in the world, then if there's a competitor that owns that runs that repo, then you may choose not to contribute, and that's no good for anybody really. So so it gives a little bit of credence to the whole process.
I think one thing you mentioned was particularly important, which is the longevity. So the Linux Foundation, like most organizations that are either standards organizations or publishing organizations that are legally referenced, typically you'll have something like, the National Library of UK or America or France wants to store the cultural stuff. My microphone moved. Wants to store the cultural stuff that comes out of the country. Therefore, you have to say what format it's going to be in so that you can restore it again in 100 years' time. So you want an organisation that's not the BBC, that's not the ITV, that's not any of the vendors, to remember what it was that you made. And if all the BBC output is TAMS, you need to write enough of that stuff down so that you can actually decode it at 100 years in the future. And there's no point saying, oh, we wrote it in C using Microsoft, it's fine. Just fire up Microsoft in 100 years' time, it'll just work. That's not good enough. So, and this is done by law in most countries. And it's one thing that makes media slightly different to, baking or other industries that are big but don't need the standards the way that we do. And the Linux Foundation's particularly good at that because it provides the framework not just for the documents you write describe the code, but they put stuff in place that provides the code base and the longevity and the record keeping and all that really long life stuff. So we might be able to see your work in 100 years.
I'll go for that.
I won't.
I think there's a piece as well of kind of it depends who does it. And I think that's something we found with the TAMS work is for most of the broadcast industry, we're a customer, not a vendor, quite explicitly as an organisation. But the people we compete with, the sort of work we do in the back end of the media supply chain, that's not our USP, it's the content. That's what we build our business on. So we're almost a neutral player, which helps us in doing work like this because it means we can have the conversations with those vendors. I think that's probably harder for something like DMF and MXL because of its origins, and that probably means you're pushed to something like the Linux Foundation much faster than we are. maybe that's the right answer for us as well. I think your longevity point is a really good one. Yeah. It'd be interesting to see where that goes.
It'll certainly be interesting. I think media is particularly unique in this area because we like to remember what we did in the past. Sometimes favourably, often unfavourably, but we like to remember.
So in terms of what DMF has in the Linux Foundation, is that software or is that defined interfaces? What are the artifacts there?
Yeah, well, primarily it's software, and so for sure, the aim is that it operates as a normal Git repository, and you go there, you get the documentation you're expecting, and you'll get the enough code to run what you need to run. And I think what's interesting that's coming out of this conversation is making sure you know what it is you need. In this situation, I think it absolutely makes a lot of sense to have some code there to say this is how it works. Not dissimilar to the way that Codex create their own encoders and decoders as a reference.
It's like a reference implementation.
Yeah, and so at least you can see how it works, and if you want to use it, you use it. If you want to replicate it differently, then you can do that. And that's a really important part. But I think it's also interesting that you've said, well, actually, perhaps you did want to give some code, but you don't have to, right? For an API, you say these are the things that matter. And coming back to your point, perhaps it's that's really the value is the concept of the API. Whereas MXL is a bit different because we're trying to get everybody to work together, and sometimes it's better to kind of lead with code.
So I guess one of the things in the background of this conversation is we've got the tech giants, the Googles and the Amazons and the Facebooks of the world. They don't put their standards through SMPTE, right? They're not interested in broadcast industry processes in broadcast standards bodies. They probably don't even know who the EBU are, with the greatest respect to the EBU, of course. So how is the future that we actually have to do more with them, and where's the balance between working with, as it were, the global tech standards bodies like the W3C, the IETF, whatever, and it's a very different, as we've already discussed, it's a very different cultural approach to standards. So what's the balance between doing that and maybe some of the more traditional, media-centric workflows, which, Bruce, as you rightly say, we actually have to be quite prescriptive so that the cultural archives of our world are readable in 100 years' time. So actually, how do we balance that, and where do these different standards bodies fit in? Because I feel like there's a real dissonance between the way they work and the way the tech industry works and the way the broadcast industry works.
Well, I think you've basically asked exactly the right question. So the stuff that we move around needs to be really tightly constrained, because if it's constrained, then more people can get at the same stuff. So TAMS is a way of figuring out what stuff you want, and a way of saying, please, can you give it to me? But when you get there, you've still got a transport stream, which everybody has to speak the same language for, which inside it has codecs, which everybody has to speak the same language for. And those things really need to be standards, because that's the valuable stuff that you need to get at. A couple of standards that I worked on with Apple in the media industry, spookily. One was for precision timing across a USB cable, which has just gone through SMPTE and just finished now. So if you want to build your entire future studio out of iPhones and iPads, go for your life. And the other one was how to put ProRes in IMF. So what persuaded the tech giants to come to SMPTE was basically that they wanted a slice of that Hollywood marketplace, because they wanted to play in Hollywood, so their stuff had to work the way that Hollywood wanted to make, because Hollywood's sure as hell not going to go out and rebuild all of their clusters just because it's 10 cents cheaper. They don't care about that. What they care about is the stuff that they're making and the people that make it. So if the barrier to entry is really high and the standards are acting as like a protection mechanism, people will jump over that barrier and go to the people who have the standards. And for something that's very cultural, like TV and cinema, I think we have enough standards organizations around the world to do exactly that. And the tech giants come to us. But on stuff that's just, oh God, how do I plug these two things together to make it work across my software-defined workflow with my software-defined network, with my software-defined computer sitting with my software-defined pod running my software-defined software. Hang on, where was the stuff again? That can be ephemeral. No one really cares as long as when you build it, it works the first time and you've tagged it, and next week it might work the similar way.
It goes back to what you were saying earlier about the fact that the, say, AWS Media Live now supports tags. If you look at the options that they're not trying to set a standard.
No.
They're trying to, support as many standards as possible. It's not in their interest to try and stamp, right, this for us, this makes sense. It's trying to be as broad a house as possible.
Because they make the money through the operations side, not through the IPR side.
Exactly.
The other thing to bear in mind is that there's not a lot of... most of the stuff that we spend our time talking about is stuff which isn't really transferable outside the industry. So if you think about video, everybody uses video around the world, but the video standards aren't from this industry. They're part of the ITU and others, right? So that's correctly kind of globally defined. And when we're talking about how to move our stuff around, then usually that is really hard to apply to anyone else outside the industry. We like to think that the AV industry will be our friend, but they never really are. And it goes both ways, right? But that's like with the closest industry to us, and it doesn't usually work very well. And so there's a good reason to have people who are really just thinking about your stuff. It's a bit like in banking with high frequency trading and all of the IT that needs to go into that. Some of that's helpful, but there's not really any big transferable items.
I think there has to be a caution there, though, because I think the barrier to entering that world and just owning the whole thing end to end is getting smaller. There was a day when you would have to build some hardware and you would sling it together with SDI or something. Now this is starting to move to cloud. DMF will move it further to cloud, as with all the things we've been talking about today. We're kind of coming up on the point where if one of the big tech players wants to, they can ignore the entire world of SMPTE standards and own that content pipeline end to end and just do it. And they have the engineering ability and, frankly, the cash to just pour some money into that and make it happen if they want to. And I think the caution for the broadcasters is we've got to work together, and we've got to be able to respond to a changing market very effectively. And for us as engineers, that means we have to help our organizations respond to that changing market. So the business drives the technology, not the other way around. Otherwise, somebody is going to come along and eat our lunch and just erode that moat because, I don't know, Netflix or Facebook or Meta or somebody has decided that actually, I can make some money by owning this end-to-end through the operations.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it kind of feels like we're getting to the space where we're talking about this XKCD cartoon that Bruce posted the other day, which is the great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from, and every time somebody comes up with a new one, well, it's now another standard to choose from. I mean, this proliferation is obviously a common pattern in standards. I mean, how do we address that? I mean, is it really a problem? I suppose is the first question. Or does it matter? And if assuming it does, how do we address that? How do we mitigate that problem?
I think software-defined everything is fundamentally changing the supply chains. So when we had supply chains that had physical bits of kit, if you didn't standardize the interfaces between the kit, you didn't have a supply chain. You had bits of kit in a van. And as software starts to eat all the various places on the entire chain, you've now got various places where you can actually sort of slump a whole group of processes together and then call them yours. And lots of companies have tried that, and Netflix wants to go from glass to glass, and they're doing okay. The BBC is forced to be where it has to be for various reasons. But nobody's got the perfect model at the moment. And Warner Brothers Discovery, they've schlumped together and now they're schlumping apart again. And we still don't know what the right business model is. And until somebody figures out, what is the streaming business model that's actually got more than 2 years of legs, I don't think we're going to know what the supply chain for that business model is, if I'm perfectly honest. I mean, I could guess, but I'll be wrong.
Fair. I mean, Movie Labs published this sort of set of ambitions for media supply chain, right? I mean, is that a step in the right direction?
It's certainly a bunch of good questions that need answering.
Okay. And are any of the standards that we talk about today, and any of the things that we talked about, do they go anywhere towards answering those?
Yes, a lot actually. I think TAMS is pretty critical for it. I think we're sorely lacking in the security space of what media security means, and that's all the way from on set through to teenagers in the back room reverse engineering how to make things work, or just phishing where the credentials are. I think that's interesting.
Uh-huh.
So there's a bunch of stuff in that big document that's just unanswered questions, but a lot of it is, I think, to your point about if you've got a few GitHub repos chained together, you can do a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
You can do a lot of stuff, and you can do something differently tomorrow and give a better service to someone.
Uh-huh.
But at the end of the day, what you still want is the stuff, the media that the people wanted to watch still has to get delivered.
Yeah.
And the closer you get to that thing that has to stay the same for a long time, that's where your standards become important. Everything else, I think, is just going to end up as a tagged repo somewhere.
I mean, let's talk a little bit about. I mean, we'll get into AI, right? But before we get to full on talking about AI, let's talk about trust and the proliferation of content, and then therefore the provenance of real content. And are there any standards that we are looking at, that we're talking about, that can actually address that and can provide, if you like, I mean, maybe this is a use case for blockchain. I mean, blockchain's been looking for a good use case for a long time, hasn't it? So maybe this is a use case for blockchain, for actually showing that actually this video that was made 20 years ago and it's genuine, and it's got this chain of validation to it. And do we need to think about standards like that?
Well, the C2PA exists, and so that the idea of that is to watermark the origin of media. So I get the feeling that it's a little bit like those yellow dots that are on printed paper. You don't really notice they're there, but if they ever need to go in and find out who printed it and where, then somebody can analyze it. But the whole point of those dots that printers put on is that most people don't remember they're there or don't know they're there, so you can catch them out. So similarly here with C2PA, if you accidentally create something which is marked, then that just helps prove it, and it also means that media organizations can create their own media and just say, look, this is already marked cryptographically secure with with what we've got. So that's great, right? And there's a lot of work that's gone into that, and there's another IPC accelerator on that topic this year. So that has got massive amounts of engagement from vendors around the world. From media organizations around the world, because it's so critical. Mm-hmm. So it's a good start. I think that's a better start, in my opinion, than the detection. But that's always going to be a cat and mouse game.
The challenge with something like C2PA is yes, you can cryptographically sign that this piece of content is the same version as the one that's in this BBC system, and you can verify that with standard cryptography. That's great. It's really easy to strip it out. Yep. So you end up with, I have this piece of content, it says BBC News in the corner. We didn't make it, but it says BBC News in the corner. And how do you prove that negative? That's that detection piece. That's really difficult. And I think, in some ways, there's an aspect of all technology problems are actually people problems in disguise. That somewhere down the line you have to critically assess, where did I get this piece of media from? It says it's from the BBC, but I can't find it on their website. Is it, or is it a deepfake? I don't know how we get further on that, though. I feel like the kind of media diet piece is almost going in the wrong direction. And C2PA is one solution, but there's got to be more to it. I have no idea what it is.
And I would say the window is shrinking. Yeah. Because we're at a point now where AI is more commodity now, obviously, than it has ever been, and it will get more commodity. But we're still in a place where the vast majority of media on the internet or available to end consumers is real. We know it's real because it hasn't started yet. But within months, years, people are going to be able to generate extremely high quality replicas, and then how do you know what the original is? At the moment we can say this is real, this is how it is. But over time, when all of that imagery and all those videos and everything's generated, we start to lose that fight. Was
it you that did the Google SLSA slide, trying to prove trying to prove that the Python that Google made was the one and true Python that shall be worshipped, as opposed to the other Python? Yes. It's the same problem, but the trouble with Python is it takes quite a long time to generate a Python language, but it takes no time at all to generate a petabyte of video.
Exactly.
And the real problem is that you could track the whole supply chains quite easily, but then, well, goodbye GDPR. Everybody knows what you're watching and it's published all the time and it's in the blockchain, so you can't unwatch it ever. I'm not completely convinced anybody will ever vote for that. I mean, I'm sure we've got that already in certain countries, but it's not something people are going to like.
So we're already kind of talking about AI. I mean, I don't know if we need to have a long conversation about AI, because but AI is really what everyone talks about everywhere right now at the moment. Probably for the next year or two before the next hype cycle comes. I don't know. I mean, AI is big. There's no doubt about it, right? So is AI relevant to this conversation? Obviously, other than in the ways that we've already covered, is it relevant in any other ways that we should be thinking about?
I think it is, because I know it was what you were saying earlier on about we have to have these strict standards to be able to ensure that we can reconsume the media that we put in today.
Yeah.
But do we? Because in, say, how many years' time, you give an AI model, this is video, right?
Yep.
Work it out. And it's like you'd say, okay, it has to work it out because it understands the standards, it has to work out the standards. But at that point, it may not need to. It understands the concept of what a video should look like. You could say this is a video of X episode. It already has an idea of how that should be rendered, what it looks like, what it sounds like as of an era, and it can just work it out.
So would you be comfortable with your home movies going through Grok 7 just to be sure that you've got them?
No. I get it. I suppose it's not for me. It's not a question of do I want it. It's more of a question of could it.
Could it? It absolutely could, and I think that's one of the scary things, is that it's a difference between do you restore an old movie or do you preserve an old movie, and actually both are required. If you want to show it and get viewers, you need to restore it so it looks nice and looks modern.
Yeah.
But you want to preserve the original because you don't. Last thing you want is like a 1980s footprint on it or a 2005 footprint or a.
And it goes back to what we were just saying in terms of how do you authenticate it?
Yeah.
Because at that point you've got interpretation potentially. Because what if it is corrupted? What if there is some problems and now AI is putting things in there that didn't actually happen?
Yes.
It's enhancing it in ways.
Grok 7 has all the movies of the world, only had white actors. It's like, how did that happen?
Exactly.
That would not be good.
No.
AI today, it's one of the places that we've yet to find a real use for AI as opposed to ML is in live workflows. You've only got a few milliseconds to deliver the next packet. There's not much to do. You haven't got any thinking time, and there's not really much that you don't want to be deterministic. So, although there's increasing amounts of let's call it just AI in codecs, proposed new codecs, which is a great idea. We've seen the benefits of super resolution and things like that. So we've got that, but there's not that much for live that I think is really even foreseeable in the future. One of the great things about AI may be that it will allow us to, as kind of you're alluding to, throw away some of the kind of API documentation, because either you don't need the API, or if you do need the API,
it'll figure it out.
Yeah, kind of figure it out, and no doubt will be better in the future.
So AI could make interoperability easier.
Might get you out of a hole easier. I mean, it's back to the archive, issue, really, isn't it?
AI will get you halfway there faster, but all the way there slower, in my personal opinion.
As long as you project manage it.
It's probably a terribly expensive way to solve that problem. Like we already have
the
production processes that bin a load of metadata. Actually, it would be quite useful if we had that at the other end of the chain. Please.
What a great idea.
Yeah,
Wish I thought of
start
that.
Yeah, I'll stand off my soapbox now. Put someone else on it.
So I'm conscious that we've only got so much time in here, but I think what I want to wrap up with, and maybe we'll try and go around each of you, is I see that there's two visions of the future, right? And thinking about open standards, interoperability, open source, there's a vision. Can we articulate a vision of getting it all wrong and a vision of getting it all right in each of your views? What does wrong look like and what does right look like? Let's start with you, Russell.
I mean, for sure, we've got as Bruce was referring to, we've got these streaming companies who, is it 2 years you gave them for each iteration? It's a bit harsh, but we'll go with it.
No, it's 18 months really.
It's all about the business cases, and if we don't get open standards right, that's going to get in the way, and it literally could take down companies if they're fighting already to be efficient and do things the best way. Taking on debt or whatever, okay, they've made their mistakes, but the best thing that we can do, as always, as kind of engineers on the technical side, would be to make everything as efficient and as clean as possible. And I think messing this up could have consequences.
Okay. Sam?
I think access to good, high quality, well balanced and curated information and journalism is critical to the health of our society. And I think there are business interests that exist that run counter to that health of society. We see this with the whole idea of filter bubbles. I think there is a path through this where that continues to grow and the role played by the likes of the PSBs starts to shrink, and I think that puts us into a bad place. And I think there's another path through this where we as engineers help those organizations to continue or to start to win against some of the perhaps more mercenary commercial interests that would do anything to make a profit versus that health of society piece that the PSBs inevitably have as their remit that helps them kind of evolve to fit into that new world and work together more effectively and grow to match their audience needs against the needs of society as a whole. There's almost a take your medicine piece that comes.
Sure, I was going to say that. How does open standards support that vision? It's a great vision, but how do we use open standards? How's it how does it fit in?
We make it more practical to play in this market kind of commercially against those players who kind of, as I said earlier, can just go and do. I mean, Netflix have their glass-to-glass piece. There are, if I were a large streaming giant and wanted to own the entire platform, I could go and do that. The open standards piece means as an industry we can compete rather than as individual companies we have to compete. And I don't think separately we can do that. I don't think.
Okay. So I
think we're too small a player
Yeah.
against the internet scale, if nothing else, the social media giants.
So it empowers smaller broadcasters and
Exactly.
smaller organisations to produce news with provenance, for example, produce content that's interoperable that can be put on different platforms. Good answer. Yeah, I see where you're getting. Brilliant. Bruce?
The industry is riddled with opportunities and problems. If you want something to change quickly and you don't really care about how you get to the results, just iterate as fast as you can with all the AI and software you can throw at it until something works. If, however, you're making a great craftsman piece of like furniture, you throw away the angle grinder because that's too coarse. You want a nice fine piece of sandpaper to make certain it's just right and it's got to last a long time. Then you go the open standards route. And if you're stuck halfway between the two, you haven't properly defined the problem. Both are needed. It's not either or. You choose the right tool for the job.
Okay. So move fast and break things, and move slowly and get things right.
Yeah, move fast and break things, and when you've made enough money in a way that's going to keep going for a long time, that's when you get the fine sandpaper out and polish that solution to see your face in it.
So the old cliche, the right tool for the job.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Great. David?
Yeah, from my point of view, if I'm thinking about it more from a general technology point of view rather than a media's perspective, one of the how it is within technology at the moment is open source and open standards are basically now driving the commodity. So, if we're thinking about all of the when it comes to the APIs and specs and the infrastructure, all of the what we call today commodity infrastructure, how we generate, that's all driven by open source and open standards. So, from my point of view, when I'm looking at the media industry, for me, it's inevitable. That's what's going to drive media going forward as well. And like the pillars of that is transparency, it's participation, and it's collaboration. Yep. And so with those three things, I'm sure media are just going to be pushing a lot of these standards and seeing the same benefits that the wider technology space is seeing.
Brilliant. So I think we've got a couple of minutes left. If we have any burning questions from the floor, I can run over to you with the microphone. And
so you're dealing with the kind of authentication aspect and bringing these standards in. Being a broadcast engineer who's kind of on the front line, especially with news, how do you define the balance between doing it properly and getting in the way of your day-to-day activities? Like, every engineer knows how to get around HTTP, right? It's not difficult if you know how, but is there... How do you deal with that problem? How do you deal with the fact that if it is too obtrusive, engineers will just work around it or throw it out the window?
I think that's, if I rephrase the question as, how do you get a standard to stick?
Yes, exactly.
You listen to the Ren Woods of this world and make certain that it's not an ugly standard that just makes life horrible. Because those standards tend not to stick, even if they're imposed. They just don't have long lives. And if you get a standard about right, it might not quite be as polished as you'd like it to be, but you know what? Everybody uses it. If it's just good enough, those are the ones that tends to have really, really long legs. And I've been apologising for MXF now for 25 years, which I think is a decent record.
On the topic of kind of deepfakes and authenticating whether something, just because it has a BBC kind of stamp on it, is it from the BBC? There's an interesting law, I believe, that's going through a parliament in a Nordic country, I couldn't tell you which one, about giving individuals the kind of copyright to their voice and any likeness to do with them. So maybe the kind of angle that should be taken isn't one of standards and what can we do as engineers to approach this issue, but maybe this is something that actually has a wider implication towards individuals of, I'm a presenter on the BBC, but actually I don't want a video of me going around saying that we should do X, Y, and Z, which is actually horrific. It's less a question, I guess, more a statement.
It makes it interesting, though, in terms of individuals being more aware of their own image rights. So everyone suddenly having that sense of, right, these are my image rights, these are my my voice rights, etc., and that playing a wider part.
It is interesting that it moves the problem around. So if you go to Tesco's and you buy an orange and it says product of Spain, how do you know it's from Spain? And it's the same problem. And there's a supply chain audit that takes place, and it could well be that somebody just stuck that label on in the back room in Tesco's and it actually came from South Africa. I mean, you as a consumer probably don't care as long as the orange is nice, but actually there may be all sorts of legal and money problems around the back end. Now, the thing about a supply chain is there's money involved, and people care about money. And so my personal view is that C2PA works kind of well, but it's kind of not looking at the supply chain, it's more looking at, did it go into the supply chain right? And if we were to audit the supply chains, we'd probably take 50 to 70% of the problems away, and C2PA could solve everything else. But that's just my high horse.
There's a trust thing to your Tesco example. The reason you believe it is because you trust Tesco.
Do you?
Because you trust that the size of the penalty for lying is big enough that they probably did it right, because it's cheaper to do it right than to incur the risk of the fine. Yep. This kind of comes back to everything we do. Why do you trust? And on the internet, we have to consider this quite carefully, because frankly, you can't trust anyone or anything on the internet. Ask anyone who's ever turned all their security off how long it took them to get hacked or start to get probed by insert country of your choice. But the reason we can do that is because I can trust my bank's website because I trust someone that trusts them. That's the root CAs eventually. We have to kind of think about media in the same way.
Yep.
That why why do I trust the BBC's app? I mean, because I work for them. They pay my salary. That's why I trust their app. But why should I? Is a question to kind of... We should start to ask of all that we see. Yeah. And this comes back to this idea that the technology problem is actually a people problem. How do we resolve that kind of web of trust thing to figure out, I trust something you say because I know you, but how does that expand up to function in this new landscape? Answers on a postcard, please.
One last thought about that is that it's in a sense you're saying, well, how's about using laws? Because it's the proposed law, that they will have copyright and that will have implications. As part of the IET, I'm one of the champions for the IBC accelerator for the AI incubator. And one of the things that we've done is created a whole lot of documentation around compliance and ethics, so that it's a little bit like if you imagine GDPR, because we know about that more. You've got somebody who's in charge of controlling the data and people who are named and responsible. The same thing can be true for AI. You have people, you have a plan for when it goes wrong and when it starts being racist or whatever, and you scramble to sort that out. But you have a plan for it, and and it's all part of making sure the privacy is respected and you understand how it's going to be used. If you were to then create a supply chain situation through laws, then, as the EU seems that it likes to do, then that is one way that you can at least mitigate part of those problems. And so laws aren't always perfect, because we've just seen, if we believe what we heard in the news about the BBC license fee, if something's a law and no one feels it's enforceable, it doesn't matter, right? But there's a balance there, and there's potential.
Well, a balance, and there's potential. I mean, I guess that's
in the most optimistic thing I've heard all week.
Well, I guess in terms of all of the different trade-offs that we talked about today, with different standards bodies, different approaches, different competing commercial interests, different financial models, all of those things, I think that there's a balance, and we need to find a way. Is a good way of summing it up. Actually, what we need to do is use the right tool for the job, and the right set of standards bodies for the for the set of standards that we need to do something. Maybe AI can help. We're not necessarily sure yet. So with that, I would like to thank you all for your time and for coming here this evening. So a big round of applause for our panel, David, Bruce, Sam and Russell. So thank you very much. Don't forget to subscribe. Next time.
Standards are just actually a tool to get people to talk nicely and play nicely in the sandpit.
Press subscribe.
We're talking about new technologies, fundamentally.